Okay, well, thank you so much for inviting me. As I say, really sorry I couldn't be there with you. I have been sort of challenged by Christian to talk about where research on democratic innovations is going. I think this is such an interesting project in the way that it's relating sort of transitions and democratic innovation. So I'm not really particularly going to be focusing on the transition aspect. I'm focusing more on what we know from within democratic innovations research. And I'm going to talk generally about that research and then specifically on a short bit on climate assemblies to illustrate some of the points that I've been making from work that I've been doing at the moment. Just the context, which I think we all know, everyone in the room. I think the interesting, I think the first presentation makes it very clear about the kind of the complexity of the policy landscape here. I think that in itself is colliding with a significant democratic deficit. And so one of the interesting questions that is emerging is how the extent to which participatory governance or democratic innovation can be a practical and realistic response to this. And I really want to stress that idea of one response. Sometimes in the literature you would read democratic innovation is the response to everything, but I want to really be much more, much less. I want to reduce the kind of claims that we can make about the space. What do I mean by democratic innovations? The specifically, we're talking about institutions that have been designed to engage everyday people in decision making. Now, what this has meant in the literature, and partly I think work that I've done and others have done have affected this, is that there's been a tendency to focus on government-sponsored spaces as they relate to policy making. And in that space, a tendency to focus on novel government-sponsored spaces. And explain why that might have a bit of a problem. There might be a problem with that novelty later. This has meant that within the literature on democratic innovation, this has been to the detriment of participatory governance that is happening in other spaces, within civil society, within social movements, what is being referred to very often now as the commons, or within social economy, within more sort of, and in your kind of the areas that were just being talked about, things like energy communities, that sort of thing. So there is a skewing of the work within democratic innovations to those processes that tend to be sponsored by government. The other interesting thing I think about this space is the extent to which it's boundary spanning, and that a lot of people are working in more than one space. So I'm an academic, but I also work in policy. I work with practitioners like Zacchio's in the room. I work with democratic and climate activists. So you've got this kind of interesting kind of interface, I think, which is not, of course, other areas of work see it, but I think it's particularly obvious within work on democratic innovation. The other thing is that work is becoming more professionalized, and what that means is as the new cohorts of postgraduates and are coming through the system, actually they're becoming more academic in their approach. Now, that may be a good thing, but I also think in terms of the rigorousness of studies, but I also think it's a challenge because I think some of those connections might be being lost during the professionalization. I think we're also seeing professionalization within practice, and we can talk about that as well later on, or you can anyway. So what do we know about democratic innovations? It's a really difficult question to answer because there are so many different types of innovations. And I think one of the challenges that happens in this space is people generalize too quickly. It is just the case that different democratic innovations have different characteristics and will enable inclusion in different ways, will enable influence and popular control in different ways, will enable considered judgment, etc. And so that makes it really difficult to make generalizations about where we are. I think in terms of about the nature of any particular innovation or innovations in general, what we can say is that over time there is a tendency for these things to emerge as quite as quite challenging and, if you like, quite radical ideas, which then become less empowered practices as their use travels. And participatory budgeting is a prime example of this, that in Latin America, it involved quite significant redistribution of resources, restructuring of the state. And now it's kind of like a small process where you distribute funds, in most places, where you distribute funds within a community. Still important, but doesn't have the same sort of structural changes. What do we know about the impact of democratic innovations? Actually, remarkably very little, and which sounds like a bizarre thing to say, but I think there are reasons for this. That's because early studies tended to focus on the capacity of citizens to do this kind of work, and not necessarily on the broader impact of democratic innovations. Because of the tendency to focus on innovation, it tended to focus on exemplary cases and not the whole remit of innovations. And there are just simply conceptual and methodological challenges to attribute changes to specific interventions. I mean, if anything from the last presentation shows us about how complex the policy world is, to be able to say this particular thing changed things is incredibly difficult. And then finally, actually getting the time and resources from funders is really hard. I mean, we've just done some work on the French Convention on Climate, and only 5 years later can you really start to see the kinds of impact that it's had, and no one really funds those kind of studies. I think what we do know is, and it's kind of obvious, that impact tends to be affected by the wider context within which institutions operate, and so we're starting people talking about, let's not just focus on the process itself. This is kind of obvious, but the wider assemblage of institutions and processes. And there's some really interesting work emerging now about how the kind of logics of participation and logics of bureaucracy and logics of electoral politics actually help us understand some of the barriers and, of course, opportunities to the sort of impact of democratic innovations. This brings us to the question of embedding. How do we actually embed these, particularly as we start to think about transition? There's a really big debate. Well, it's not that big, but there is a debate going on about sort of the use of terms like embedding and institutionalization. Institutionalization is this kind of like, asking this question about whether institutions are more permanent or have become a more fixed part of the political infrastructure. I think the interesting thing there is permanency of institutions does not necessarily obviously mean effect. And I think that's why this kind of term embedding has become a really interesting question. But one of the areas that I think hasn't been explored enough is it always about embedding in state structures? Or are we also thinking about embedding as, in many ways, counterpowers within civil society or within the commons? I think that's a debate that is really only just beginning about what we mean and where we understand embedding to be. Just one comment, I think anyone who goes into the literature, I think there's been a bit of too much dominance in the literature around democratic innovations by the normative theories of deliberative democracy. And that's been to the detriment of using other ways of thinking about democratic innovations. And I think there's been an unfortunate elision within that discussions that deliberative democracy equates to citizens' assemblies. And I think that's a deeply problematic conceptual mess, basically, that doesn't help people as they enter that literature to see the world of innovation, of democratic innovation, in different ways. Fortunately, we are seeing new ways of looking and thinking about the world as the interest in participatory governance and democratic innovations extends. So within normative theory, more critical accounts of deliberative democracy, participatory democracy, post-colonial theory and agonism have really been kind of like started to bite in terms of the way they're thinking about these spaces. Again, explanatory theory, something that's already been mentioned by people in the room, but new institutionalists, people working on social practice, STS, new materialism and political economy are starting to take an interest in this space. And we are seeing new arenas away from government-sponsored spaces into the commons and decolonial practices as well. So just a little bit about just focusing particularly on, I guess, what's the flavour of the month at the moment, which is citizens' assemblies. And I some of you will know that I run an organisation called the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies, which is funded by European Climate Foundation. It's not an academic network. It's actually trying to help practice and policy to try and learn from what's happening out there. And recently, I tried to capture some of this learning in a short open access book. But what I just wanted to kind of share with you is some of the sort of way in which I think some of the academic literature is actually slightly divorced from practice. And I think partly is this because I recently did an analysis that was showing, or not, just a quick piece of analysis that showed how by a significant order of magnitude, there are more academic articles now about citizens' assemblies than there have actually been citizens' assemblies. And I've got a feeling there's actually probably been more money put into research on citizens' assemblies than has been put into the practice of citizens' assemblies. And I think this is a real problem. I mean, I think the problem, it shows itself, and I think there's become within academia a kind of debate about assemblies that is failing actually to reflect what's happening on the ground. It's kind of that's not to say that there isn't some really good research out there. It's just that the academic research, I think, has taken directions that aren't necessarily that helpful for practice. And I think one of the things that the academic literature hasn't recognised is that there are a series of emerging trajectories of assemblies. The most common still remain government commissioned assemblies. They're one-off assemblies. But there is this emerging permanent assembly infrastructure. This is where assemblies are actually become part of governing structure. I've already mentioned the one, I don't think I mentioned it. There was a picture of the Brussels Permanent Climate Assembly. There are other citizens' assemblies that are becoming part of and embedded within governance structures. We're also seeing some really interesting, and I'll say a little bit more about this to conclude, civil society commissioned assemblies, not least in Norway, recently on the future of the oil fund. And these can be more mainstream or radical in their adoption. Some of them are really set up as, if you like, as counterpowers towards the state. And then we're also seeing assemblies commissioned within organisations. And we're just about to do a knocker call, which is going to focus on assemblies which are running within universities, within pension schemes even, within public authorities, within the authorities, and not elsewhere. And I think this is really interesting about new forms of organisations, of democratic innovation within organisation. Just quickly, I think Nabila Abbas and Yves Santamer give us a really nice way of recognising that we're actually when we look at assemblies, we see them in different ways depending upon sort of theoretical and political commitments. They use the term deliberative democracy here to sort of talk about assemblies that are just seen as, if you like, a supplement to existing representative structures. We see people who are looking from a more anti-political perspective, who see these as spaces away from politics, which itself, if you like, is corrupted in some way. And then a kind of form of radical democracy, which sees assemblies, if you like, as a sort of precursor to alternative ways of doing democratic practice. And so we need to read that when we actually see assembly developments. And we're starting to see really strange bedfellows. I don't know if some of you might know the person on the person there is Roger Hallam, who was the person who came up with Extinction Rebellion, recently released from prison after 2 years for work on Just Stop Oil. And on the right-hand side, OECD. And we have the OECD, with their talking about catching the deliberative wave, very much assemblies as part of existing governance structures, as a way of integrating assemblies within existing representative democratic institutions. And on the other, we have Roger talking about the zombie carbon state, and that it will be citizens' assemblies that will form the basis of alternative governing structures. These are radically different ways of thinking, as are obvious, of thinking about assemblies and about democratic innovation. And I think very often a lot of the work is focused very much on that government space without recognising there is this kind of more radical area. So just 4 points, I guess, just to take away. The first is we are seeing a diversification of work, but I worry still that there's a sort of danger of path dependency within academia. where people follow on the kind of, in terms of, for example, using deliberative democratic theory or placing everything within a deliberative perspective and not using other ways of seeing the world. I think this is also true in practice, where assemblies are the sort of go-to at the moment, where there's a range of different ways of doing participatory governance. The second point I wanted to bring out, because I think it's relevant to what you're working on within the NORTRAP project, is how to embrace the kinds of perspectives that we heard about in the first presentation, and how to bring kind of, if you like, systems thinking into the world of democratic innovation, both in terms of system thinking about where democratic innovations fit, but also systems thinking within democratic innovations. I've seen a lot of interest in this, and my worry is sometimes that there's a sort of technocratic creep here, where you undermine the vitality of participatory spaces. And I think it's a tension I really would like to see us explore more, about how much of this kind of, some of, you know, these sort of large scale, more systems thinking approaches can be actually articulated and developed within participatory spaces. Thirdly, I think impact analysis is a really critical aspect of the work we're doing. A lot of the stuff we're doing, we're having to work on fairly, with relatively limited understanding of the long-term institutional and political context and impact on that. And finally, I think the big question for me is how we mainstream and embed this stuff. It's interesting thinking about transition. I guess thinking about political transition here. What does it take for participatory governance to become a reflex within politics rather than something that's referred to as innovative? And then just finally, I think a sad irony I'll leave you on, I don't want to leave you feeling too up, is the need for democratic innovation. I think has never been more obvious, given the kind of political context we're facing, given the kind of challenges we're facing, given the kind of deficits we're facing. Our understanding of what works is becoming more sophisticated, even given what I've been saying about the lack of long-term impact analysis. And yet the political conditions that we face at the moment are arguably less conducive to this kind of work. And this is a circle we're going to have to square, or whatever the phrase is that we should use. Much of what I've been talking about today, I've just recently written in the form of a chapter at the end that ends the second edition of Stephen and Oliver's handbook. If it's useful to anybody, I'm very happy to share. But thank you very much for your time. I hope that's a useful input. I'm not going to be there to find out either way, but I hope it helps.
Thank you. Thank you, Graham. And I think together the two presentations actually span what we are discussing today, like transitions on the one hand, and how to implement these, how to develop these in like new democratic processes. Since Graham will not be around the rest of the day, even if we're a bit over time, I would allow a couple of questions to him if you have them.
Thank you, Graham. Very interesting. Benjamin, by the way. I'm just torn because I like the idea of these democratic innovations, but sometimes democratic people don't want democratic things. And I'm reminded of Thomas Edison's notion too, that sometimes, education has to be forced upon the population, even if they don't want it. And we've done some work using the ecology of participation framework, which you may know from Tom Hargreaves and others. That's like a whole spectrum of engagement. And we recently ran a global survey in 30 countries asking people, how do you want to be involved in climate interventions? And like 20% said they don't want to be involved at all. And others say they want to be involved but only with information. And others say they want moratoriums. And others say they want to innovate. So it's kind of like there is no public, there's publics. And I guess what happens if we ask democratically if they want to be involved and they say no? Do we then respect that? I guess how do we handle publics that don't want democratic innovations?
Yeah, so the first thing is, I think it's a challenge for us to be asking people about ways of working that they have little familiarity with and little understanding of. Most people's understanding of participation, if they have any understanding of it at all, is turning up on a wet evening to some local council meeting, which is completely dreary and full of people who are either as mad as hell or really supportive. And it's kind of like a really poor experience. So one of the challenges we've got, and I think we have this challenge in survey research in social science, is trying to survey people on a thing that they actually know have had little experience of. What we do know, and I know this from working with assemblies, is that people who participate in assemblies come out the other end, and many of whom will participate in assembly because they're being paid. They haven't turned up because they've got some feeling of civic duty. It's because they've been given an honorarium. They're being invited to stay in a hotel. Some people have never stayed in a hotel, and that's the reason they're there. But the enormous enthusiasm for doing this kind of this form of politics from those people who have been part of it is always strikes me as quite unbelievable, and I'm really quite shocked by it. So these are kind of two interesting problems, I think, is that the experience of those who have been part of assemblies, and because of the kind of democratic lottery we use, a lot of the people in there won't have had political participation experience. The experience of those who have been through those processes is almost, the majority is an absolutely positive experience. Surveying people, asking them about assemblies in abstract, people aren't that interested. Now I don't know how that pans out. All I know is, and I'm enough of a sociologist, is as you create these kinds of spaces and these spaces become more influential, that will shape people's ways of thinking about them. So I guess this is a project which looks at the existing ways of governance and sees them as lacking. And one of the things they are lacking is that lived experience and the kind of different perspectives or that participatory governance can give you. But in the end, if we start to instigate these things in a way that actually has significant and meaningful impact, will that shift people's opinions? I don't know. My hunch is it will, but it will also lead to political reaction from those people who do not like that kind of form of politics, and we're seeing that at the moment. And that's for me a really interesting. A more interesting battle is that a lot of people in this space want to be apolitical, want to kind of like say that participatory governance is, can be seen from any political angle. But actually, I think there's a big political fight on now, and for me that's a good thing. It's a more honest thing that actually this is about a particular type of future. So I rambled on there, but I think it's kind of important that we don't rest too much on that survey evidence, because the actual experience of participation tends to run in a slightly different direction, and there will always be people who are against anything.
But I think it's a very interesting question, which we are also working with, not necessarily so much in this center, but we are working on a new application that looks at different forms of participation and different groups in the population and participation needs, and there we actually don't want to put this assessment only on survey work.
No, I think that's right, but I still think there's something really interesting, Christian, about the fact that these are spaces that are very different from the spaces that we tend to experience. Yep. So that's the challenge is kind of like is getting meaningful evidence on what people are interested in, not interested in, accept, don't accept, etc. And I think that's a really interesting problem.
Exactly. Yes, we have time for one more question. It's all going. You won't have any time to drink coffee now afterwards, but
well, I will.
You will, yeah.
Hello, Graham. This is Inês Campos. We've met once. I interviewed you with Roberto. I don't know if you recall, from Insight Them project. Well, my question is about time. The political time that takes for a policy to be developed, to be then implemented, versus the political perspective, or the perspective of time that people have when they participate in climate assemblies, for instance, and they think, oh, we came up with these great proposals, and then a year passes, 2 years pass, and so what? Often it's not just a legitimacy problem, but also a problem of time. And I think from some case studies that we worked on, it can be very frustrating for the people to participate, can even make them be against the process altogether. So what would you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm the first to say that, you know, kind of like the idea that you could just kind of run a one-off assembly and somehow expect policy to, you know, after it's gone through the policy system to somehow magically appear that completely reflects that is madness. And so we absolutely have that problem of the sort of expectations of citizens within a process, and then the kind of the complexity and of the policy process that follows. There's a couple of there's a number of thoughts there. One is that one of the challenges here is we haven't really understood how to embed, as I mentioned this in one of my slides, a sort of deliberative or participatory logic into the sort of existing bureaucratic and electoral logics that we have. And those places where actually these assemblies, because I know more about those, but we can talk about other forms of participation as well. These places where participatory governance has actually had a meaningful effect are places where it isn't just about running a participatory process. It's been about restructuring and developing the culture of the bureaucracy within which they land as well, and actually developing kind of feedback loops. And this is where it's kind of interesting now that we're seeing this move towards, I'm not necessarily saying that this is where we want to see everywhere, but more sort of permanent infrastructure. So, for example, I'm really interested in the permanent dialogue that they've put in place in East Belgium, where there is a part of I'm not going to go into the details of it, but there's a part of the infrastructure that is constantly citizens reviewing what has been done in the name of other citizens, and kind of like that's actually a constant reflection and review of that. And because it's been happening now for 6 years, the bureaucrats and politicians seeing this as part of the cycle of politics. And that's really, really unusual. I can only point to 3 or 4 places where that's happened. Most other assemblies have just been a one-off thing. And actually the French Assembly is a really good one. I mentioned this, the French Convention. When that ended, after about 3 or 4 months, everybody said, well, that was a waste of time. Only one or two things have been implemented. We've looked back 4.5 years, 5 years later and realised actually it's much more complicated than that. About 20% of the proposals were implemented in full, and about 40% were partially implemented. I can't tell you whether that was the assembly that had that effect or not. I can't tell you that it wouldn't have happened anyway, but it's certainly a different story than was told in the immediate aftermath of the assembly. And part of that again is because that assembly happened, the citizens came out and went, well, where's the change? And of course that's not how so I think what's interesting is this sort of second or third generation of assembly development, where actually it's becoming part of the infrastructure of government. I'm also interested in these things as, can we think of them as institutions which are outside and if you like are overseeing and monitoring government externally. So I think that's the interesting question. So I think what you're pointing to is deeply problematic. And we can understand that, and I think that we need to think about how we design these institutions given the reality of the policy process, and not as if, and I think someone like Fishkin he used to say, the moral force of these things will change policy. Well, it doesn't. It absolutely doesn't. So we actually need really to think quite carefully about and that's why I use that word assemblage rather than just the assembly itself.
Okay, thank you. I think we need to move on. I don't want to deprive you, but thank you again.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure, Chris.